So to start this off, instead of just me asking a question, we actually came up with a different plan, which is to have Alexandra read a short reflection that she wrote in thinking about this panel and the feelings that she had around its topics. And we're going to use that reflection as a way to kind of kick us off and get us thinking. So I invite Alexandra to read.
All right, everyone. So this is a short kind of reflective essay type piece that I'm gonna read to everyone. I was feeling anxious, and so I took an online yoga class this week. The teacher asked, "How are we all breathing today?" But what does she mean by breathing? And who is we? I have asthma. My sister's is worse. The writer Marcel Proust had asthma during his life, but in France at the time, they understood asthma as anxiety. Anxiety sometimes feels like asthma, but their triggers are not always connected. In Professor Greg Mittman's book, Breathing Space, he outlines how the US first envisioned asthma as coming from the outside environment. Wealthy Chicagoans escaped dirty cities to clearer Wisconsin skies. Then asthma was something that could be combated in the home. Air purification systems promised a fix. Now asthma is dealt with inside the body through the prednisone inhaler my doctor prescribes. Yet asthma rates have continued to rise as air pollution has increased. In the Navajo Nation, asthma rates are 2 to 3 times higher than in the general population. People burn coal in their homes. Their heat, air, and economy is entangled with 2 predominantly coal-fired power plants, the San Juan Generating Station and the Four Corners Generating Station. Pressures from those desiring clean energy has led to the abandonment of these plants by California and other major energy consumers. The Navajo Nation and other political actors are working to transition rather than immediately decommission the plants. In 2014, Eric Garner, a former horticulturalist for the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation and an African-American man, was killed by an NYPD officer who put him in a chokehold while arresting him. Asthma is listed as a contributing factor in what the medical examiner ruled as a homicide. Video footage of the incident, the horrors of him repeating the phrase, "I can't breathe," 11 times while being deprived of oxygen went viral. It spread through social media, contributing to growing anger at the inappropriate use of force by law enforcement. The grand jury did not indict the officer, which sparked nationwide protests. The Black Lives Matter movement, "I can't breathe," resonated, becoming a main slogan succinctly speaking to suffocation from structural. The current global pandemic and the shared experience of being alone together inspired my college friends to reconnect. My friend Rebecca lives in Norway. She mentioned the forest fires in Brazil and the reoccurring phrase, "the lungs of the earth are on fire." Bolsonaro, the populist president, says that the rainforest belongs to Brazil, perhaps justifying the policies and activities that are to blame for the intensity of the blaze. Lula, former Brazilian president, is claiming that Bolsonaro is leading Brazilians to the slaughterhouse. Coronaviruses are zoonotic, meaning they are transmitted between animals. Zoonotic diseases as animals are forced out of their habitats, which are increasingly being destroyed through deforestation, urban expansion, and wildlife trade. Each year, billions of animals are slaughtered in overcrowded factory farms. Squalid conditions breed disease. At the North American Paleontological Convention, Professor Shannon Peters followed the question of what might happen if we burn all the living cells on Earth, all the forests, everything besides humans. From this thought experiment, he concluded that aside from unthinkable destruction, the CO2 would be less than the worst-case scenarios for fossil fuel emissions by 2100. As countries have powered down in the wake of the pandemic, there have been coyote sightings in New York, part of a hopeful rhetoric that nature is bouncing back as harmful emissions have decreased and water and skies have cleared. Coyote folklore filled my childhood, a trickster who can outsmart others towards his own desire. Reading too quickly. Otessa Moshfegh says that Americans take the coyote as its totem because it takes creativity to make milquetoast of bloodbaths. to trick people, re-narrativize colonization and slavery, and because Americans are especially good at doing that. Countless people are suffering and dying from the inability to respond to a respiratory virus. Black Lives Matter is petitioning for access to healthcare, testing, and a plan for decarceration as the early statistics reveal what we could have guessed, that Black people in Chicago, Louisiana, Michigan are dying at rates 2 to 3 times their population share. In New Mexico, 38% of deaths from COVID-19 are in the Navajo Nation. When the crisis hit and nurses were demanding protective personal equipment, ICE agents went to people's homes to carry out deportations wearing N95 masks, the American coyote at work. I am trying to ease the tightness in my chest, to rebalance my cortisol levels. In fact, I'm trying to turn my anxiety into grief. In traditional Chinese medicine, grief is processed by the lungs. Grief is a transitional period of acceptance when something has changed and will never be the same. If excessive or not processed properly, grief can weaken and damage the lungs. Respiration will be compromised, and some people will have a flare-up of asthma. In this tradition, when the lungs' vital energy is strengthened, we can breathe deeply and let go of toxic negativity and prejudice. Climate change is not only an issue of carbon in the atmosphere, but stems from a way of life that will exacerbate already extant issues of inequality and violence. Back to normal is predicated on death upon death. I'm trying to breathe, to figure out how not to go back to normal. I am wearing a mask and maintaining social distancing. Joan Didion said, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live. Denial and delusion dictates our political, societal, and economic stories. For me, I don't need a diagnostic, a name, an answer, a narrative. Instead, I want us to use the phrase halt. Are we hungry, angry, lonely, tired? I'm not sure how else we will grieve the losses that we have and will endure." That's the whole reflection.
Thank you, Alexandra. I feel like we all need just a second. There's a lot there. And a vulnerable and meaningful piece. So let me say something a bit procedural for a second and remind everybody on the call that if you have questions, we invite you to add them to the Q&A, and we're going to try to incorporate them as we go along. We probably won't have time for much of a long Q&A at the end because we have some other fun things in store. But I think let's start sort of launch from Alexandra's piece, which I think one of the real benefits of starting with that piece and one of its kind of brilliant aspects is the way that it skips slightly between so many places and topics that surround this idea of anxiety of to our planet, what's happening to ourselves, and how do we cope, what's happening to other people, what violences are being inflicted on other people. I mean, the number of sort of ideas brought up has really ranged quite a lot, and some of them were quite challenging: prejudice, racism, violence. A lot of those being very differentially distributed among people, and especially people of color, people from the global South, poor people. So, but I think I want to kind of lift up just a little bit over the top of some of these and kick off the conversation, or actually ask you all to kick off the conversation by thinking about the idea of connection, because I think that's one of the things that's at stake in what you wrote, is this idea of connectivity. You use the phrase being alone together, and that's kind of the crux of where we're at now with the pandemic. And in a sense, it's also the crux of where we are with climate, in the sense that we are trying to be together, and yet we often feel alone, which is to say we lack agency, we lack a sense of connection to the other people that might help us make a difference we feel alone in our political systems. And so negotiating that sense of being both disconnected and overly connected to what's happening in the world, I think is really fundamental to the kind of sense of anxiety that often gets kicked up in thinking about climate change and environmental degradation writ large. And then again, this pandemic. Um, so I'm not going to really ask a pointed question. I'm just going to kind of push that out there, this idea of connection and how it connects to how, what Alexandra kind of offered us, and see whether, at least first, Dekila, Ally, either or both of you want to comment here. We can see where this goes.
Yeah, and I would completely agree that connection is very important in dealing with these things, and how connection plays a really large role in both how we talk about climate and how we're all dealing with what's happening right now, as well as what's happening in terms of the pandemic. When I started learning about the climate, learning about the environment, and having a little bit more of a academic relationship with nature, I felt anxious. I felt a large weight that comes with studying these things, and I felt alone. I mean, I knew that the folks around me were learning the same thing, but there was never talk of how to cope with these feelings, or that these feelings exist for other people. And I was fortunate enough to attend the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Ed conference last fall, and there was a climate anxiety workshop there. And for me, it just sounded like something that is interesting, and that I'd love to learn from. And it was in that workshop that I really realized, wow, like I am not alone, that there are people everywhere who are experiencing this, and some more firsthand than others. And it kind of just made me think more about the fact that I need to surround myself with people that know how I'm feeling and support me in the work that I'm doing, and the things that I'm learning, and that we are in this together. And in terms of being distant but also connected and in this together, I mean, we're all studying, we're not all studying, but a lot of us are studying the environment and how things are happening in our world, and we're all studying it on our own or sometimes in groups, but there is a larger community of people who are dealing with this, and I think connection to that community is really important. And then the direct parallel to us in this pandemic right now, we're all staying at home, we're distant, but we're all in this together, and we're all experiencing this, often in different ways, but we're all experiencing this, and can find connection through that.
So I think the first thing I really want to stress and say is that eco-anxiety or climate distress are valid, healthy responses to an existential threat. I feel like a lot of us who experience it are somehow, ashamed of it, or somehow feel like it's something to hide or something that we cannot confess, particularly in academic professional settings. However, having experienced it firsthand and then seeing it almost multiply like an epidemic in the conservation and climate world, fine, now I'm amazed when people actually say to me that they don't experience it. That is what surprises me, because it's so revealing to me of either the privilege that people have to say that they aren't afraid of what's to come, right? Which means that this epidemic, this, whether it's COVID-19, whether it's climate change, they don't expect it to change their lives, or that they really have emotionally disconnected with nature. And I think when we talk about climate anxiety and eco-anxiety, we have to also parse it out, because people have very different experiences of it. There are people who get very overwhelmed. There are people who are paralyzed. There are people who shut off. Everyone has a very different response. This kind of numbingness that happens, or this, this inability for us to, for example, absorb information, all of these are also normal. Those are all normal coping mechanisms that we in our minds are developing to address the anxiety we experience. So for me, the real trick when we talk about eco-anxiety is learning to recognize these symptoms, right? To recognize our own symptoms, and to basically recalibrate our coping mechanisms so that we're in a better frame of mind. We're in a frame of mind that allows us not just to be mindful about what's happening internally, what we're experiencing and how that's making us behave, but also for us to manage the anxiety and do something, I don't want to say constructive, but do something that aids us along the way. And what's interesting about psychologically, what helps us the most through climate anxiety are the very things that we tend not to do. So it's action, right? Because we tend to veer away from action when we are often anxious. It can be, you know, absolutely frightening to break out of that fear cycle that we lock ourselves in. But actually, any kind of action you do, however small, however big, is one of the best things you can do to address climate anxiety. The second thing is what Ali and what all of you have brought up, which is being in community, finding people that you think of as community. They don't even have to be present in your lives every day. They could be community from all around the world, but it's people that make you remember you're not alone, that make you remember that you're part of a group, that you're part of a family and a community. Those are the two best things you could do to address climate anxiety and climate change. Like, how wonderful is that? Right? The problem that results in all of this suffering also can be the solution to end the suffering. And so I think it's really important that we learn to remind ourselves again and again and again that the pain we experience has an end, and that end is in our hands. It's all about the practices we cultivate in our daily lives.
Nathan, I think you're still muted.
Classic mistake. Thank you. Thank you both for those responses. I think this is one of the things that I think is great about this combination of people on this panel is that we have all of you, even just from a kind of, let's call it professional stance, coming from different places and different experiences and different times in your lives. Ally, I wonder whether you could say a little more about your experience of either talking about climate anxiety or feeling it together with your peers. And you obviously, I know you have, as part of our intern group at the Office of Sustainability, you have a number of peers whom I know, but you obviously have a lot of other peers. And UW-Madison, just to take one institution, is a very large place with a lot of undergraduates. So curious to have you kind of reflect, not to put you on the spot as our representative undergraduate, but insofar as you are that, how much can you, what would you say about the kind of awareness or willingness to talk about this?
Yeah, I mean, when I came to UW as a freshman, I was obviously very new to like the academic community, and I really didn't have a community when it came to like working in the environment and studying the environment. And I think that's when, I mean, I was still attending courses and still was around people, but I didn't have that core group of people that I felt that connection with, that I knew that I could go to talk about these things. And I find that in general, like students aren't given the tools in their classes to process these feelings when we're talking about the environment. I mean, we learn lots of things, and we often don't take the pause and take the time to really think about how we all process this information and the impact that it has on our lives. So I felt even more anxious at the beginning of my college career because there was all this information coming at me that I really didn't know about before. And I was kind of working through that on my own because I didn't have that core group. And then as my classes got a little bit smaller and as I developed this core group of people that I really feel like that they have my back and that they know what I'm going through, I found it's been a lot easier for me to deal with the anxiety that comes with dealing with climate and feeling not so alone and feeling like I have the ability to deal with this and continue to move on. Because when I don't have that sense of connection and when I don't have that core group of people that I can go to, I feel that I run out of stamina. I run out of gas. It's harder to keep going and to keep learning and to keep pushing about the things that I care about when I don't like have the resources to deal with those things like in my own life and how I'm processing them. So as a student, and to any of the other students that may be attending this, I would just say to find that group of people, find someone, email me. I mean, and anything like that, that you can help like build that sense of connection in those around you.
So Alexandra, I don't want to sort of leave you out there. You're a graduate student. I think being a graduate student is frankly a difficult thing. There's a lot of privilege in being a graduate student in some ways, and in other ways, um, it's a strange, isolating, difficult experience. Some people cope with it better than others, and I think one of the things that's interesting about it is that it's one of these situations where the more you learn about the world, the more complicated and overwhelming it becomes. And I think graduate school reinforces that in a lot of ways. So I kind of put the same question to you about your experience of sort of feeling these feelings amongst others in your social group. In you don't have to keep it to only other grad students, of course, but just insofar as that's one of the identities essentially that you bring to this conversation.
Yeah, I guess for me, I feel one of the things I feel really grateful for is so when I first came to UW-Madison, I'm from a department of kind of famously critical scholars who do really great work. And when I first came, my advisor suggested that I try to find things that I could highlight that were kind of things that I saw going right in the world, and how to find them and how to like be the person to bring them resources. And that's a lot of her work, but I think she really was like, how do you bring that critical lens and also like find a space where things are going right and you want to be a support and you want your work to bring kind of resources, you want your work to bring whatever it can bring, and also you want to place yourself in that position where you can learn from that space. And I've pretty much just done that for several years now, and I think that puts me in a better psychological place than some, which doesn't mean to say that the other stuff isn't really fantastic and important work. I just got lucky in that I spend a lot of my days thinking about climate change, but I also spend a lot of my days thinking about people and movements that are inspiring. So I don't know if that answers it, but I think that the experience, in terms of the experience of being a graduate student, I think I have an arts practice, and maybe that's part of just knowing that like there's a lot of uncertainty from day to day. And the only difference is that I'm really seeking collaborators differently, because academia is sometimes a less collaborative space, depending on where you are in it.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems to me it speaks directly to Dekila's community kind of coming together through the lens of your intellectual work. And one of the problems with graduate study is that it can excise you from community, at least especially in the humanities. I think in the sciences, it's paradoxically, which is considered a hard thing, hard sciences. There's a lot more interaction with people sometimes than when you're stuck in a carrel writing a dissertation on some esoteric book or something like that. And speaking to my own English background. I'm curious, so I think I'm going to kind of continue on this thread and Dekila, ask you, so your role as director of the LOCA initiative at the Center for Healthy Minds, you're it's a center on campus. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what the kind of work that you do there, and some of the things you've already kind of expressed some of this, but some of the things that you've noticed in your interactions with maybe staff and faculty on campus. I know you also work through the LOCA initiative with faith leaders, and so this question of faith and religion and spirituality and sort of in various ways yielding oneself to a higher power or to another kind of structure as a way of not just dealing with anxiety, but providing kind of a basis for good living. I think all of that is very relevant to this. So big, messy question, but I'm curious to have you talk a little bit about your background.
So I began working with faith leaders in 2008, and it was completely organic. I didn't plan to. I was at that time the WWF US director for the Mekong, very much in field conservation. I did it because I'm a Buddhist coming from the Himalayas, an indigenous Bhutia woman, and the head of my Tibetan Buddhist lineage asked me to create environmental guidelines. And I really thought it was just this one-off, one-time thing I do. But in the process, something shifted in me. And what happened was I finally was able to address the depression and the hopelessness I was experiencing around environmental and climate issues, because all of a sudden I had brought the sacred back into the science. And in some ways, I look back and think I had to viscerally experience it to be able to argue for it and change my life to match it. If someone had just said that to me, I don't think it would have, I think it would have registered intellectually, but I had to go through it emotionally. And so I began working with Buddhist leaders in the Himalayas and then convinced WWF to let me work with religious leaders in other parts of the world. So, I worked with the Catholic Church in East Africa and worked with evangelical preachers here on climate change in the US, and sort of got to build relationships and a lot of trust among faith communities. And what I learned in the process was that no faith leader ever turned me down when I said I want to come and talk about the environment and climate issues. No one ever did. They all wanted to know what they could do. A lot of the hiccups were around language, so if I could say creation instead of biodiversity, that would just magically open the doors, right? So the first lesson to me was that here we are talking about community and social isolation. We in the conservation science world had isolated ourselves so perfectly. We were living in this perfect castle where we really were struggling to reach out and build these relationships. And a lot of the work I've done since, and thankfully I'm now doing here at UW-Madison, is to open those dialogues to say that we are actually part of one big community. Human nature is such that psychologically we have in-groups and out-groups, and we tend to say, this is our in-group, and we in the climate conservation will do it as much as anyone else, right? And I think part of the work that Loka does at the Center of Healthy Minds, which is very focused on looking at human well-being in general, but also looking at how human beings change their minds, how human beings grow, right, in terms of neuroplasticity, looking at methods that develop us as people, but also, I think, in terms of community. And so coming here and building this program has really been about expanding that in-group for faith leaders to include scientists and vice versa. Expanding the in-group for scientists and academics and policymakers who work on climate and environmental issues, to expand the in-group to include faith leaders and indigenous leaders.
Sorry, I had to find my unmute button there. That's truly, and I think this idea of the in-group and out-group is something maybe we can spend a little bit of time on, and the others can chime in. And I should say that I know I've been asking direct questions of each of you, but I hope that we can feel free to unmute yourself and jump in. I'll keep an eye on your microphones, and we can try to make this a little bit more of a popcorn experience. So, we have a question in the questions right now, which has to do with how we hold the agricultural industry accountable in the fight to combat climate change. And one of the things that I would actually take from that question, which is not so much a direct way of answering it, is we have there are feelings that there are industries, there are groups, there are political parties, there are whole religions perhaps that are more or less responsible for what's happening right now. And there are ways in which that is true, and there are ways in which it's always more complicated. And regardless, it sets up a fairly resilient, to use a word that's a good word in sustainability these days, but I'm going to use it the other way. We have a very resilient sense of that's an out group, or that's a group I don't want to be a part of, and this is a group I do want to be a part of. And just to add another layer, we have the problem of technology these days, of algorithms that are driving the way that we read news, of talking heads, radio show hosts, and so on, who tend to try to drive conversations in certain ways, and they reinforce that in-group, out-group problem. They reinforce essentially anxiety and insecurity because those things drive clicks, they drive views, they drive conversation, and they drive adherence to different kinds of policies. So, but I don't want this to be just a negative situation. I'm curious what experiences our panelists have with trying to bridge some of those gaps between in-group and out-group. Or do you feel just stuck right now? Because I know that sometimes I just feel stuck. And I think anxiety when it comes to climate is often a sense of stuckness. So if you just feel stuck, you can talk about that too. But I'm curious also about those the actions, the community building, the in-group, out-group, kind of breaking through that membrane.
So for me, in high school, I was very involved in the National FFA Association, so Future Farmers of America, and had a very agricultural background in what I was studying, and found myself really, really passionate about that. And then coming to UW, I found that some of the things I was learning was really opening my eyes to the ways that agriculture can be very harmful to the environment. And I was finding these two things as very separate and as two different viewpoints and not really coming together. So for me, that was a little bit jarring, and it was difficult to work through until I realized that obviously we need agriculture. And kind of bringing this back to like the original question, we obviously need agriculture, and the practices maybe aren't the best, but ultimately the farmer still cares about their earth. They care about their animals. They care about the work that they're doing, and often we may think of the people in the out group as being outsiders, as being not having the same views as us, but oftentimes they have the same views. They value the land, they value what they do in their everyday life, and how it relates to the environment. So I guess for me, taking those two separate things and bringing them together and being like, you know what, we're all on this earth working through this together, and maybe certain practices aren't the best for the earth, but it's our responsibility as a collective whole to kind of break down that wall of in-group and out-group and be like, you know what, we're in this together, and rather than ousting them into a bad group or those who are doing the most harm.
I can go next. I think the question to ask is, why is agriculture harmful, right? Not just agriculture, you could take any industry and ask it, because in essence, it's not. It actually provides food for all of us to eat and to survive off of. So I think for me, it's been a gradual learning process of understanding that the problems we face and the problems in a weird way that climate change and COVID-19 are exposing are systemic problems that we have. A lot of it comes down to, the fact that we globally are gripped by neoliberalism, right? This idea that this pretense that actually the economic world order, whether it's global, whether it's here locally in Madison, whether it's being practiced, by farmers and large-scale farms and monocropping and so on, the idea that it's a laissez-faire industry, that that we should just let it run completely free. Freedom is like the ideal that they talk about. But in reality, of course, it's completely monopolized and manipulated, right? It's sort of this illusion of choice when actually you have no choice. You walk into a grocery store, there are 2 aisles of cereals, probably 200 different kinds of cereals, and in reality, they're owned by the same 2 companies, right? Maybe 5 companies at most. That to me is the real problem. That is a systemic problem. It's taught us to think that the people we hate are the workers, right? We should hate the farmers, or we should hate the managers of these industrial plants, when the reality is the system is set up to benefit a very small section of the population. And that could be true for climate change, and that would be true for COVID-19. And the fact is that ultimately, if you look globally or you look locally in the US, it's what it reveals is the social inequity that is rampant in our systems, and a lack of social protective nets, safety nets, right? And so whenever people ask me, talk about the problem, what I always end up saying is, let's take a step back and look at the system behind the problem.
I guess I'll chime in to say that I completely agree and think that that's a good frame. I think you said it so well that I'm not sure that I have much, Dekila, to add to the way you said that. I mean, going back to, if I try to draw a thread from the thing that I said in the last comment, would be also just try to look for the spaces agriculturally where it's working. I mean, I think right now is a really good time to check out CSAs and to think about where your food comes from and the distribution of your food. There are some great kind of COVID-19 crisis kind of community CSAs coming together that are joining, like, you know, many farmers together. And then just to look at the issues where you are. In Wisconsin right now, there's a lot going on with farmers needing to pour out milk. And like just looking into that allows you to see the milk prices have been dropping, their wages have been dropping. You know, certain companies, as you were saying, have made tons of money off the backs of farmers. And yeah, you can also say, okay, maybe I don't want to support the dairy industry, but what does that look like as a transition? What does that look like as a thing that respects the people who are doing that work, or how to do that work more sustainably? And I think that, yeah, looking to those initiatives at UW-Madison, there's a lot of really fantastic initiatives, and I think those have helped me a lot. When I first got to campus, I was on a white paper looking at cranberry bogs across the state, and met a lot of really interesting cranberry farmers who are totally different than me, but also have concerns about the lack of freezes and what that's going to do to their bogs. And so, yeah, just finding the shared struggles and finding the positives, I think still is a good lens, and looking deeper at specific issues that let them become complex.
That's all super helpful. I want to say a couple of quick things here. One, I think we'll probably shoot for those of you who are in attendance to wrap up around 8:10 to give us enough time. So hopefully you're able to stay about that long. I just want to make sure it might be a little bit sooner than that, but I just want to make sure that we have enough time for our final pieces here. There's also a couple of important questions that came in. One was just what's a CSA, and I want to make sure that's said out loud that it's a community supported agriculture. And I don't know, Alex, if you want to say Alexandra, if you want to say anything about the what that entails to you, but we also have another question that came in too. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think just look up, just look up. I mean, I think that I don't know where this person is from, so I have such a local perspective of what it looks like where I live, but I think it's trying to directly kind of work with a farmer, and usually there are kind of groups that have helped kind of organize CSAs, and then if you just type in CSA, you might be able to find one near you, but it's a way to kind of give your money directly to this farm and allow them to kind of sustain and support through that, and then you get food.
And oftentimes what that looks like is you sign up for a share, and you receive perhaps a box of produce once a month, or however you set it up for what is in season directly from the farmer. So it's a great way to support local farmers.
So another question that came in that came directly to me that I think is worth talking about, especially in the context of those of us on this panel being situated at the university, and this being UW-Madison Earth Week event. The question is, how can teachers, oh, I just lost it, it's squeezed down. How can teachers, formal or informal, best incorporate tools and moments for processing into our lessons on climate change and other topics that might cause eco-anxiety? Let me try to sort of rephrase that. How do we teach better these tricky subjects that might cause the feelings that we're kind of processing here in this panel today? And all of you, I think, could probably have some very interesting things to say about this from your different positions.
I can go first. So I would really encourage them to look up Center for Healthy Minds, which is where the local initiative is hosted, because they have a free app that provides lots and lots of meditation techniques, lots of different kinds of contemplative practices that help with anxiety. And they work with local schools all across Madison. I mean, they work with kids that are, I think, 5 years and older. So there are a ton of techniques out there to deal with the anxiety as you're teaching climate change, right? But the other thing, and I now find myself advocating for this quite vocally when I give public talks, is that I think we actually need to encourage parents and teachers to teach different kinds of things at school and at home. And that includes a number of things that would be anxiety provoking, but are necessary and practical, like survival techniques, wilderness survival techniques, right? First aid, all of those things that we thought are no longer necessary in our world, but that actually not just provide practical tools to deal with, let's say, uncertain times, but that also really bolster confidence and instill confidence in young students and young kids, right? And so as we're dealing with climate change and as we're dealing with all the emotions it provokes, we're also supplying them with the type of practical things that boost their confidence, that make them feel not only can they survive it, they're prepared for it. There is absolutely nothing that can replace preparedness as a mental strategy. You know, I do a lot of work around disaster preparedness with particularly Tibetan Buddhist monasteries in the Himalayas. And my big takeaway last week was that the monasteries that actually have climate disaster preparedness plans were prepared for COVID-19 already. That there is something in the mind that shifts when you do any kind of preparedness work. So this would be my appeal and my request and also my answer.
For me, something that I've found to be helpful, or that could be helpful as a teacher, as someone who may be speaking to students who are learning about the climate and learning about the disasters that face us all, is in an effort to give them those tools that they need, is making the time and the space in your curriculum to work through these feelings, to address these feelings and say, these are real, these are valid. You are not alone in working through this, and we are kind of all in this together. And something else that could help is providing a creative outlet to work through grief. And we're actually going to have something like that at the end of this roundtable event that you could use as kind of a template. But having a creative outlet to work through that grief, or providing ways for students to deal with it, is definitely something that I would find helpful in classes that I'm taking. And I'm sure others would too.
I couldn't agree more with both of those things. I think thinking through how do I kind of, if you are in a position where you do need to kind of deliver certain types of content and assess that content, to think about how can that be empowering? How can I turn that into something that there is a feeling that they have like an action or something they can do or are ready? And then how can that also be processed through ways that they can work with each other and work with themselves to kind of restory it themselves and have some ownership of it? And I think tools for kind of creative expression are a great way to kind of slow down the information and have that information kind of something that can be processed and owned and shared.
So let's see, 7:55. I think maybe we can do an answer to one more of the questions that's come through. And then we'll take the last 10 minutes to kind of come back to our bodies and breathe a little bit together, and then talk about our artistic request, which we really hope that you all stick around for this last little bit. The question is, and actually related, there's two questions that have come in, and I think they're kind of related. When you have all these larger systemic problems, it's really hard to figure out what to do as an individual, to have personal resilience, to cultivate hope. So I wonder if our panelists could talk a little bit about how you cultivate that sense of personal resilience. You know, what gives you hope? What helps you keep going?
Okay, I'll take a crack at it. I think, okay, so how can I put this? I've given up on hope. What I fight for every day is courage. And I think for me, this idea, you know, for a very long time, I was lost in this emotion and this attachment to not having hope, and a feeling that I was doing something wrong because I felt so hopeless. And I realized at some point that, especially if you're in the front lines, either in terms of impact, let's say, of climate change or ecological devastation, or in the front lines as a scientist or as a researcher or as a teacher, whatever it might be, as a student, right? We are taking in this data that basically is turning us into modern day Cassandras. We are shouting at the top of our lungs and feel like no one hears us. And that gives us legitimately a real feeling of hopelessness. And so for me, I had to detach from my attachment to hope and say, what is a more beneficial emotion that I can cultivate? And what I found was I can actually cultivate enough courage to go through day after day after day, slog it out, try to come up with different systemic solutions, try to come up with different strategies or different, partnerships, right? And I think going back to the earlier point you made, yes, I know exactly what you mean about being an individual and looking at these systems and feeling overwhelmed. And that's what they're designed to do. And honestly, that's what they use media for, right? They use media to basically tell us that we're alone and nothing we do is going to make a difference. I mean, just look at, there are two pieces of information I can give you to explain what I mean. First of all, 80% of biodiversity in this world is managed in indigenously managed lands. Now, when we talk about DAPL and monarchia, right, when we talk about Native Americans who put their bodies in the front lines, in front of the police, to prevent any kind of trespassing by the oil companies and gas companies, how do we feel? For the most part, how are they presented? They're very much presented as domestic terrorists. There is a plan. There is a plan in place to make us feel that alone and to make us feel that powerless. However, we, even as consumers, have so much power. When we collectivize, when we decide we want something, we are able to change the market. I mean, look at electric vehicles as an example. Solar panels, the price of solar panels, right? So I think, again, we have to realize that what we need is courage to fight back in a way that's constructive and that is brave and that is really smart, and that it might take decades. It might take the next generation or the generation after to win, but that's what we're in it for.
I think I'll add too that I think if we're saying that one of the kind of things that might feel good is to kind of find ways to take action and find ways to be with other people, to know that you kind of can't take on everything at once. And so thinking about which of those spaces, which of those activities are enjoyable, where are they happening, which resonate with you, and kind of choosing your battles and choosing which ones make sense so that you do have something that you're doing. I think we named, obviously there's infinite things you can do right now. We named that inequality was going on, and I know that where we live right now, there's a lot going on with Madison and Milwaukee rent strikes and petitions to kind of think through universal basic income and other things that are happening right now in other countries that are helping the pandemic, and how do we kind of bring that here? That might not be the thing you see, but I think that doing that thing with other people is part of that, so that you're kind of just finding things. And I think that can be hard, but if you like, any of the centers on campus, if you like the initiative that, Dekila talks about, to just reach out, send an email and say, I like what you're doing. Can I help? And you might say, I don't have much time. I don't have many resources. And that's okay. I think just to step in the way that makes sense.
And yeah, Alexandra, I really agree with that in choosing your battles and choosing what you want to spend your time on. And something that I've found in working through this, like myself, is I need to be kind to myself as I'm dealing with these things, and I need to realize that it's a lot. And in talking with people and pleading my case and trying to get points across, sometimes that can be very, very exhausting and draining, and remembering to take a step back. And when I do that, I feel more courageous. I feel a sense of hope. And sometimes just taking a breath and taking that time for yourself to address what you're feeling, but then kind of take a step away for a little bit, has helped me to be more resilient in a way. And something else in dealing with the stress that comes with climate anxiety is really trying to connect with the environment in a mindful way. In the past, I've always enjoyed being outside, but I never really thought about what that means to me and thought about how large of a role that can play in my anxiety and how I work through these things. So I try to be really mindful about my time outside and recognizing the environment around me and taking note of the way the grass feels and taking note of the way the birds sound when they're singing is ways that I can feel a connection and feel like the environment is there supporting me as much as I am working to support it.
It's a great transition. So in our last several minutes here, I'm going to turn it over to Dekila to lead us on something like a breathing exercise or meditation. I'm not sure where you've settled, Dekila, but we'll come along with you gladly. And after that, we'll leave you all with thanks and with a little announcement of this writing project we'd invite you to be part of.
So yeah, as Nathan said, I think Ally said was perfect because that's kind of what I thought one of the many, many, many hundred practices, meditation practices that are out there, contemplative practices that are out there, is about reconnecting with nature and kind of remembering that we as humans are part of nature. I think that we feel so distant so often, you know, whether it's in the process of studying, whether it's in the process of living in urban cities, whether it's just we're locked into our daily grind, right? So what I want is that everybody, you can stand if you like. If you're seated, I just want everyone to be able to feel their body settle into wherever you're sitting, whatever you're sitting on. And so we're going to start from the bottom up with an awareness exercise and a heart opening exercise. So if your feet are on the ground, if your butt is on the ground, I just want you to remember what is holding you. So the first thing is that we are seated on top of the earth. The earth is literally holding us right now. You can take one hand and put it over your lower belly. And just as you breathe in, that's what you're filling up first. The air that comes in is filling up your belly first. When you breathe out, that is the air that goes out first. So you're deepening your breath and slowing your breath. I want you to be able to think about the impressions that your toes are making, or the places where your body is really pressing into your seat, which is on the earth, or directly on a mat. How your body yields, right, to the hardness. So you're gradually softening as you breathe in and out. I want you to move your awareness up to your heart. Feel your lungs expand. Breathe in. As the air fills in your lungs, think about where the air begins and where you end. Where does the air end and where do you begin? It's indistinguishable, the air and you. And how all of the earth, all the trees, all the living things are providing you this air, allowing you to be, to thrive, to fight, to protect. You're breathing in the earth's compassion. Now I want you to reverse that. Breathing out compassion to the earth. You're breathing out all the tenderness you know the earth feels for you. You can visualize your loved ones. You can visualize people that you worry about, people that irritate you, people that annoy you. And what you are doing is you're taking in all their suffering. You're taking in the earth's suffering right now. And you're giving out compassion and healing. Every time that becomes difficult, I want you to feel your feet. And I want you to remember that the earth is cradling you right now. So every time that it's painful, it feels too much, it angers you, just ground yourself. Everything you hear, everything you see, everything you taste comes from the earth. You are indivisible. It's a really easy exercise, so I encourage you to try it. You don't have to do it for more than 2 minutes at a time, but I offer it as an exercise that might help with the anxiety. And especially when you feel separated or you feel alone, this is a really good practice. I hope it helps.
Thank you so much, Dekila.
That was wonderful. Thank you. Beautiful way to end this. So as we conclude, I want to invite you attendees, to contribute to this conversation beyond the wonderful questions that you sent, and the way that we have come up with to ask you to do that. And of course, this is optional, is to write a letter. And we hope this allows you to express your own feelings about climate, about COVID, about anything that connects the two, your thoughts, your hopes, your gratitudes, your worries. And we are hoping to collect these letters. We're thinking them as sort of a message to planet Earth or to nature or to the people in your life to think about these things out loud. And we are hoping to collect these letters, and we will create a special web page for them to display them. And hopefully a physical location. We had worked out a spot in College Library on the first floor that we were going to try to display all these letters. And so we're hoping to come back to that when we finally get to return to campus. I am going to put in the chat to everybody. So I'm hoping you can access the chat. Let me see if I can do that. And of course it's gone. Come back, chat. Here we go. So I'm going to send to all participants a link to the prompt, which is a PDF, and it's hosted on our website. And it goes into more eloquent detail what I was just talking about, this idea of writing a message to planet Earth, to nature, or any name you might have for a shared home. And hopefully to bring some of the thoughts and feelings that have come out of this conversation. And if you want to write it by hand or do an illustration or a comic or something and take a picture, we would love to have that. You can also type it, and we'd love to have you send it to our main email address, and then we will curate these and find a way of displaying them and sharing them. They can be anonymous, or you can include your name. It's up to you. All of this information is on this PDF. And we're going to be sharing this out to the larger community sometime next week, we hope. But you all, our dear attendees, are our first group to be offered this idea. So we hope you'll consider it. So with that, we'll close it off. Thank you so much to our panelists, Ally, Dekila, Alexandra. Thank you to Ali Berg for helping out on the back end here. Thank all of you for coming and for being part of this conversation with us. And we hope you'll consider coming to or attending or participating in some of our other activities, events, and so on happening the rest of the week. You can find it on our website, sustainability.wisc.edu. You can also follow us on social media, and forgive the plug here, but we've got a lot of other good stuff coming up starting tomorrow morning. So thank you all again.
Thank you. Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Ally. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a great night, everyone.